The slave trade. Sadly, slavery has existed as long as human society has. In fact, extensive slavery already existed in Africa long before the arrival of Europeans. Muslim traders had long exported Africans as slaves to the Mid-East and Mediterranean regions. When the Portuguese initially landed along the west coast of Africa, they took some African slaves back to Portugal. These slaves were looked at as something of a novelty, but there was little market for slaves in Europe. It was the colonization of the New World that created a huge market for African slaves. Most of the slave trade was done in Western Africa. Europeans did not have to capture slaves themselves, they merely traded with African kingdoms that had slaves. The Kingdom of the Asante was a large African empire that provided many slaves to European traders. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the name of the middle trip in the trade triangle. Triangular trade began in Europe and made its way to Africa, bringing manufactured goods like gunpowder, guns, rum, and iron. Then the Middle Passage moved from Africa to the Americas, transporting slaves. The trip across the Atlantic took between 2 and 4 months, depending on weather conditions, which could be quite stormy. But generally, it took 6 to 10 weeks. Conditions on the passage. The size of slave ships varied, but average ships were approximately 100 feet long and 20 feet wide. Ships carried anywhere from 450 to 750 slaves. The difference depended on how tightly the slaves were packed. In a loose pack, slaves could lie on their backs and were given a space of 6 feet in length by 16 inches in width by 18 in depth. Only 450 slaves could fit on the 2 decks this way. Often captains tried to maximize their profits by packing more slaves into the space. In a tight pack, slaves were forced to lie on their sides. As a result, more slaves died during the crossing in this configuration. Though a tight pack might carry more slaves, the death toll was higher this way, and often did not yield greater profits. Slaves were given enough food and water to keep them healthy, and were generally brought above board once a day for some fresh air and exercise. It was important to keep the slaves relatively healthy. Sick or wounded slaves couldn't be sold or wouldn't bring a very high price. Still, the slaves spent most of their time below deck, shackled in deplorable conditions. There were no bathrooms, and water was too valuable to be used to wash down either the slaves or their living quarters. Diseases like scurvy or dysentery claimed many lives. Generally 10 to 20% of the slaves died on board the ship, or as many as 50% in the case of tight pack.